Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are strapping on our economic history goggles and going all the way back to the foundations of the modern world.
All the way back.
We're diving into a really crucial question. What ingredients, cultural, institutional, even nutritional, what were the things that were absolutely essential for that explosive leap forward we call industrialization?
That's right. And the source materials you shared as well. It's just a magnificent collection of cutting-edge essays. They're heavily inspired by the pioneering work of Joel Mokyr, who really focused on the role of knowledge and institutions.
Right.
So this deep dive isn't just about, listing a bunch of inventions. It's a really intense exploration of why sustained economic growth took root in certain places. It's about that great divergence.
Why Europe and not, say, China, which was incredibly sophisticated?
Exactly. Why didn't they make that final jump? We're looking for the fundamental and often really surprising causes.
And our mission today is, I think it's fair to say, pretty ambitious. We're tackling four major interconnected historical puzzles.
They all fit together.
We're going from the most basic biological needs all the way up to the most complex global systems. First, what was the true standard of living in England right before this all kicked off? Were people starving or thriving?
A huge debate.
Second, how did Europe engineer this unique, highly competitive market for ideas? Then third, we explore a deep institutional paradox, how state power, which we often see as coercive, actually secured markets.
In ways that were paradoxically beneficial. It's fascinating.
And finally, we have to count the costs, the very real human and biological costs of all this progress.
For everyone from skilled workers to marginalized groups, it's a heavy but necessary part of the story.
Let's jump straight in with that foundational layer, which is literally the food on the table.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this because it's an immediately contentious debate. When we talk about England right before the Industrial Revolution, let's say around the year 1800, the data on living standards is, well, it's shockingly contradictory.
It's the core methodological conflict in economic history, really. I mean, on one hand, you have some really compelling evidence that suggests pretty high living standards.
High compared to what?
Compared to most of the rest of the world at the time. The sources point out that English wages and incomes were demonstrably high.
So we're talking about a kind of comparative affluence here.
Absolutely. You look at Gregory Clark's work, for instance, and he suggests that even the wages for farm laborers were, and this is his phrase, generous by the measure of the modern third world.
Wow. Okay, that's a strong statement.
It is. And then you look at the GDP per head estimates. They consistently place Great Britain higher than France, sometimes by a margin as large as, 37% back in 1700. Now, these estimates do vary.
But the trend is clear.
The trend is clear. And you'd think, okay, if the economy is generating these high wages and high GDP per capita, that should translate into a well-fed population, right? A population capable of sustained physical labor.
Right. It suggests a solid economic base, one that's ready for major growth. High income should mean high caloric intake. But this is where the picture immediately gets murky.
Murky is the perfect word, because the nutritional estimates just throw cold water all over that idea.
Oh, so?
This is where the scholarly conflict really sharpens. You have Robert Fogel's foundational estimates, which looked at output data, and they famously implied that a non-negligible percentage of the English workforce was actually too malnourished to work effectively on a regular basis.
Too malnourished to work.
On a regular basis, yes. And more recent, and frankly quite gloomy estimates from Stephen Broadberry and his collaborators suggest daily calorie supplies were shockingly low. They found, and I'm quoting here, remarkably little variation and no significant sustained increase in per capita consumption over the entire period between 1300 and 1850.
Wait, hold on a second. Are you telling me that an English worker in 1800 who is supposedly earning this high comparative wage was eating the same amount of calories as their great-great-great-great-grandfather who survived the Black Death?
That is the puzzle. It's a massive contradiction. Why didn't these higher incomes translate into consistently higher food consumption?
So what's the reason? Why are the numbers so different?
It often boils down to deep methodological differences. The scholars who generate those low estimates, they often rely on things like tax or production data, the amount of grain officially recorded.
Which might miss things.
It might systematically undercount self-provisioning, household production, all the non-market food sources.
So they're missing the rabbit the farmer caught for his family or the vegetables they grew in their own backyard.
Exactly. And conversely, you have other scholars like Craig Muldrew who offer much more generous global estimates of food production. And these are far more consistent with an industrious and well-fed workforce.
How different are we talking?
We're talking wildly different. Mulder's figure for daily calorie supply in 1770 is, and this is astonishing, more than double that of the lowest Broadberry estimate for 1750.
Double. That's not a rounding error.
Not at all. And the difference is critical because it determines whether you believe England's workforce was even physically able to sustain the Industrial Revolution.
So the core insight we can extract here is that for this all to work, England needed some kind of comfort zone above bare subsistence. You needed a well-fed, energetic workforce to be truly enlightened and ready for that kind of growth.
It seems highly improbable otherwise. I mean, if the lowest estimates are true, it's really hard to imagine the massive physical effort required to build and run those first mills and engines. The consensus kind of leans toward the idea that high wages and better nutrition were a necessary precondition.
You can't have an industrial revolution with a starving population.
An ill-fed population struggling just to meet daily energy requirements can't generate consistent output growth. It just can't.
And this movement away from just scraping by, it was secured not just by economic growth, but by institutional innovation that tackled the problem of famine head-on.
Absolutely. You look at the history of famine in England, and you see a clear institutional victory taking shape over centuries.
The Great Famine of the 1310s, for example.
That was murderous.
Yeah.
Truly catastrophic for demographic history. But the sources confirm that the famine of the 1590s was England's last major famine, and its impact was significantly mitigated compared to those earlier medieval crises.
And this wasn't just good weather or dumb luck. This was governance.
Precisely. This reduction in mortality was due in part to institutional innovation. And the great example is the Old Poor Law.
The Poor Law, an early social safety net.
A crucial one. And Thomas Robert Malthus, who certainly knew a thing or two about population and subsistence crises, he personally credited it with reducing excess mortality during the crisis of 1799-1800.
So the state, or at least the local parish, was stepping in.
It was crucial because it demonstrates the role of human agency. Governments and local parishes were actively designing policies to prevent their citizens from literally starving to death. And these policies worked in tandem with overall economic progress to ensure that even during bad harvests, localized hunger didn't cascade into a national demographic disaster.
It fundamentally changed the relationship between the state and the subsistence of its people. But the threat didn't just vanish entirely, did it? We often assume that after the 1590s, Britain was totally secure.
And that's a dangerous simplification. The story is one of progression, not final victory. While the worst national famines were averted, minor but still deadly subsistence crises, they persisted right up to the doorstep of full industrial takeoff.
Like when?
The late 1720s and the early 1740s, for example, they still saw the hallmarks of subsistence crises, and they led to significant excess mortality.
How significant are we talking here?
The crisis of the late 1720s, which was geographically extensive, resulted in an excess mortality of roughly 0.2 million deaths.
200,000 people.
In a population of around 6 million at the time. That's over 3% dying. It's a massive demographic shock. And these periods were also notable because they required significant corn imports, which was highly exceptional for Britain at that time.
It shows how close they still were to the edge.
Exactly. The institutional development kept the worst of the famine at bay. But the fight against subsistence was a very close-run thing, well into the 1700s.
Okay, so we've moved beyond the stomach to the mind. If the industrial worker had to be well-fed, the industrial society had to be well thought out. And this is where it gets really interesting, I think. What fueled that explosion of technological progress?
This is the core insight of this whole body of work, really. Technological progress isn't just about having a few smart people. It requires a cultural environment that values and rewards progress itself.
A culture of progress?
A culture of progress. We're talking about a transition that demanded a fundamental cultural reorientation, a shift in these deeply ingrained variables that affect economic action.
Okay, give me an example of one of these deeper cultural variables.
Well, think about something like time preference. This determines how much a society values today's consumption versus, delayed gratification, saving, and investment.
If you're only focused on today, you're not building for tomorrow.
Right. If a culture has a high time preference, valuing today far more than tomorrow, then capital formation, including the investment in human capital like education, is going to be low. Or consider the preference for leisure. That determines labor force participation and the willingness to work the long, hard hours required for factory production.
So success required a cultural belief system that actually valued progress. It's a metaphysical change, in a way, a shift away from fatalism.
Exactly. Progress could only truly take off when Europe successfully moved away from belief systems where the question, but is it true, might be routinely answered with sometimes, or if God wills it.
That's a pretty profound shift in thinking.
It is. The sources note examples like the Jain belief of Sivada, the idea that something may or may not be real, or both may and may not be real.
That sounds like a sophisticated philosophical concept, but what's its practical consequence for, say, building a steam engine?
The practical consequence is profound. If fundamental reality is understood as uncertain or relative, the core scientific assumption of testability, of verifiability, of systematic verification, it just breaks down.
You can't build reliable knowledge on a foundation of ambiguity.
You can't. The growth of useful knowledge in Europe created this self-reinforcing channel of causality. Technology succeeded, which proved that systematic improvement was possible, which in turn supported the belief that sustained improvement was desirable and attainable.
And this immediately raises the famous Needham question. Why didn't highly advanced societies like Song China or the medieval Islamic world, which had massive technical advances, why didn't they hit this sustained acceleration point?
The contrast with China is perhaps the most illustrative. In late imperial China, intellectual innovation was heavily constrained by accepted philosophical tenets, specifically the Neo-Confucian orthodoxy established by the philosophers Zhu Xi way back in the 12th century.
And that became the official, rigid canon.
It did. And the way it was enforced systemically was through the state bureaucracy. The Mandarin civil service exams, which were the only path to prestige, wealth, and power in Chinese society, they essentially became an instrument of repressive conformity.
So to get ahead, you had to master these old, accepted texts.
You had to. And this left very little room for intellectual iconoclasm or for dismissing conventional wisdom, which were hallmarks of European Enlightenment thinkers like Ramus or Bacon.
So if the fastest path to power required memorizing ancient texts, why would anyone dedicate their life to discovering something new that might contradict those very texts?
Precisely. The weight of past knowledge just kept burdening original scholarship. The sources note that even these massive treatises on critical subjects like agriculture were often over 90% citations of earlier writers.
Wow.
The whole incentive structure rewarded conformity over creative, radical questioning. And even when external knowledge filtered in, like European science brought by the Jesuits, the adoption was highly selective. It was mainly used for practical applications, like recalibrating the Chinese calendar. But it failed to shift the fundamental intellectual approaches of figures like Galileo or Newton into the mainstream. The Chinese market for ideas rigidified, while Europe's remained pluralistic and competitive.
Which leads us directly to the decentralized European innovation engine that managed to bypass all that political fragmentation, the Republic of Letters. What was this, functionally?
Well, it wasn't a formal government body, that's the first thing to understand. It was a transnational marketplace for ideas where intellectuals and scientists competed. But they competed for reputation and recognition, not just money. Its strength was its structure.
And how did it achieve that efficiency?
Through two key principles. First, high competitiveness and contestability. And second, a low ability for incumbents, whether they were philosophical or religious, to block new entrants.
So if you had a radical new idea in France and the authorities didn't like it,
You could just go to Holland or England. Because it was transnational, the extent of the market for a new idea was massive. An innovator could cover the fixed costs of their research by gaining a reputation across all of Europe, not just in their hometown.
this is where that famous motto of the Royal Society, nullius in verba, on no one's word, comes in. It encouraged sharp critiques of even giants like Newton.
It was fiercely competitive, yes. But the sources emphasize that this competition existed alongside a powerful shared ideology.
A sense of common purpose.
Exactly. Despite the rivalry, the goal was collaborative, building a larger knowledge base for the universal good of mankind. You had people like the wealthy Robert Boyle and the common merchant Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, who invented the microscope, participating actively, motivated purely by the desire to add to useful knowledge and gain reputation.
No direct interest in financial patronage.
Not initially. And we see the ultimate expression of this whole process in the story of the Wright brothers. They demonstrate the moment when this open republic of letters hits the hard wall of commercial opportunity.
Right, they're the perfect transitional example.
They are. Early in their career, starting in 1899, they operated entirely within that open-source spirit. They corresponded with figures like Octave Chanute, they published papers, they hosted visitors. They believed that progress depended on freely exchanging data.
But then came the critical creative insight, the control system using wing warping.
And that was the moment of what the sources call entrepreneurial exit. The second they realized they had a unique, transferable insight that guaranteed stable flight, that collaborative ideology was immediately superseded by market goals.
The game changed.
The game changed. Their insight prompted them to strategically withdraw from that open network and seek patent protection in 1906. And it perfectly demonstrates that while the Republic of Letters is crucial for that preparatory research, the big macro invention that changes the world often leads the innovator to prioritize secrecy and monetization.
That transition from open knowledge to protected intellectual property, that requires stable institutions. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the modern market economy seems to depend on a paradox.
It really does.
It needs coercion-constraining institutions, or CCIs, which are basically rules that protect you from the state stealing your stuff. But it also needs contract-enforcing institutions, CEIs, which is the state helping you collect on a debt.
And this is where the conflict arises, because they have what seem to be incompatible requirements.
How so?
Well, imagine needing a powerful police force, high CEI capacity, to enforce your business deals and secure public order. But then you realize that that same powerful police force gives the ruler the capacity to just walk in and seize all your wealth. That's a high CCI threat.
So the institutions that protect you from other citizens are the same ones that make you vulnerable to the ruler.
Precisely. CCIs thrive when the ruler has minimal administrative capacity, limiting their ability to seize wealth. But public order CEIs require more administrative capacity, a more complex bureaucracy, more courts, more police, which simultaneously increases the state's capacity for abuse.
You need a strong state to enforce contracts, but a weak state to protect your property.
That is the institutional tightrope. So how did large autocratic societies manage to secure property rights and maintain integrated markets without the checks and balances we often celebrate in Western history? Let's go back to China.
Right, China somehow managed to square this circle. How could they have markets that were just as integrated as Europe's, despite the emperor wielding all that centralized military power?
The centralization of military power meant merchants had very little coercive power of their own to protect their rights through force. Their security came from the second part of that paradox, the state's limited administrative capacity in the commercial sector.
So the emperor was powerful but clumsy.
In a way, yes. The bureaucracy, which was so heavily focused on the ideological control we talked about earlier, was simply not sophisticated or extensive enough to effectively capture mercantile wealth across the whole vast economy.
He couldn't efficiently track or extract the merchant wealth, so he just left it alone.
Exactly. The transaction costs of state capture were just too high for the autocratic ruler to consistently interfere, and that reduced the temptation. The state was weak where the market was strong.
So what about contract enforcement in that system? If there weren't strong state courts for business disputes, how did people make sure their deals were honored?
The enforcement relied primarily on highly effective private order institutions. These are really characteristic of collectivist, clan-based societies.
So groups like clans, guilds, regional associations.
Exactly. They had powerful internal mechanisms like ostracism or reputational damage that ensured compliance. And these systems were efficient enough to support integrated markets despite the autocratic political system.
But could that have scaled up?
That's the big question the source material raises. Could this system have adapted to the more impersonal, complex exchange relations required for modern global commerce, where trust is based on standardized law rather than, shared ancestry? It's doubtful.
Okay, let's switch to Europe, specifically Spain under Philip II. Here, the state was immensely powerful, but also institutionally unreliable. Philip was notorious for defaulting on his debts.
He was a serial defaulter.
So how did any financier trust the Spanish crown enough to fund the entire Spanish Empire?
This is a stunning example of private networks stepping in when public institutions failed. Philip II frequently defaulted on short-term, unsecured bank loans, known as asientos. These were essentially massive lines of credit, and he defaulted repeatedly even when his treasury position was often technically sustainable.
So the lenders knew the risk was absolutely astronomical. How on earth did they enforce repayment when the borrower was the most powerful king in the world?
Through concentration and market power. Repayment wasn't enforced by Spanish law. which the king obviously ignored. It was enforced by a tight, powerful network of primarily Genoese bankers. This concentrated lending structure, a textbook private order institution, wielded considerable collective market power.
They created a private financial chokehold on the Spanish crown.
They really did. After each royal default, the king was forced back to the negotiating table with this powerful consortium. He desperately needed urgent short-term finance for his wars, and only they could provide it instantly.
And I assume they made him pay for his bad behavior.
They used their leverage to settle on remarkably generous terms, essentially punishing the king by charging exorbitant rates and securing collateral for future loans.
But hold on a second. Lending massive unsecured amounts to a habitually defaulting monarch sounds like a terrifying concentration of risk for any individual banker. It seems structurally fragile. If one default wiped out a key banker, wouldn't the whole system just collapse?
This is where the financial innovation comes in, and it's truly remarkable for the 16th century. To mitigate this huge volatile risk, the Genoese bankers developed a form of securitization.
Securitization in the 1500s.
That's essentially what it was. They parceled out these large royal loans, these asientos, into smaller packets and then sold them off to a wide array of private investors.
So they were spreading the risk across the entire private financial landscape.
Exactly. The sources mentioned the Picchinati d'Inigo partnership. They were an investment vehicle that bought participations in these royal loans. Now, when Philip II declared his fourth and final default in 1596, this was a massive crisis.
It should have been a catastrophe.
And yet, because the risk had been so successfully diversified, the losses for these individual private investors were modest overall. They were just a manageable fraction of the partner's wealth. And crucially, this mechanism ensured there was no domino effect. No wave of system-wide bank failures occurred because that centralized, concentrated risk had been systematically distributed through private networks.
The Genoese solved the problem of state unreliability with private financial engineering.
They did. It's an incredible story.
That is a stunning case study of private markets creating stability where the state itself failed. So now, let's flip the script. We saw the limits of private networks dealing with state power in Spain. Let's pivot back to the state and see what unexpected benefits that very centralization of state power could deliver. Specifically, the improvement of the rule of law.
This correlation is one of the most surprising findings in the source material, I think.
Yeah.
We tend to view the rise of the central tax state, the rise of absolutism in the case of France, as purely a power grab, increasing taxation, restricting freedoms.
Right.
But in early modern France, the system it was replacing was, frankly, terrible. It was a fragmented legal and fiscal administrative apparatus that led to constant jurisdictional conflicts, massive inefficiencies, and incredible expense for ordinary people trying to use the courts. Justice was local, it was idiosyncratic, and it was often corrupt.
And this fragmentation, this localized power, it created a vacuum where irrationality could thrive. Things like witch trials.
That is the direct historical link. Louis XIV's finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, laid the foundations for this powerful, centralized state, and his motivation was purely pragmatic.
He wasn't trying to be a great legal reformer.
Not at all. He just wanted to rationalize the system and lower the costs of tax collection. To do this, the Crown imposed new, loyal, Paris-based administrators, the intendants, onto the provinces to supervise taxes and enforce new, standardized laws.
This sounds like military enforcement for tax revenue, but how does that stop the burning of witches?
It's the unintended benefit, the homogenization and rationalization of the law. If you look at France between 1550 and 1700, the number of witch trials declined dramatically, especially after 1660, and this decline was much sharper in France than in the rest of Europe.
So the mechanism for stopping the witch hunter was replacing the local judge with the central administrator?
Exactly. Witch trials were fueled by fragmented local authority. They derived their legitimacy from specific local customs and the local political systems that promoted them. The centralization push codified in efforts like the Code Michel was designed to homogenize the law to make the state more efficient at extracting revenue.
So the king's men ride in.
And by sending these intendants, whose loyalty was strictly to Versailles, the central state systematically bypassed and weakened the local jurisdictions that had previously promoted the trials. The intendants were trained jurists who were skeptical of local, often superstitious customs.
So the state inadvertently established more uniform and rational legal procedures simply because it needed a predictable, common system to collect its taxes efficiently.
That's the core tension, isn't it? The new system was far from perfect. It was top-heavy and certainly coercive in its tax collection. But in many ways, it was more equal. The intendants didn't care about local customs that might justify a trial. Their mandate was standard, central law, and revenue extraction.
Fewer people were burned as witches.
Right, but we do have to acknowledge the dark side. This legal centralization was achieved at the cost of massive violence against tax rebels and local opposition. However, the source material focuses on the long-term, unintended benefit. The drive for fiscal efficiency unintentionally laid the preconditions for a modern, uniform legal order by stamping out irrational, localized jurisdiction.
Okay, so institutionally, Europe has created a foundation for ideas and for stability. But great ideas still require great execution. The sources really emphasize that the Industrial Revolution needed more than just a few scientific geniuses.
Oh, absolutely.
It required a vast, highly skilled mechanical workforce, the top 3 to 5% of the labor force, as they put it, the people who could actually build, install, and maintain all this complex new machinery.
This is the critical human capital element. It's the necessary bridge between pure science and industrial application. And the most relevant occupation they identify was the workmen who installed and erected mechanical equipment.
These were the guys who could turn a blueprint into a working machine.
Exactly. These were the highly technical craftsmen whose skills were transferable across different groundbreaking technologies, from textile machinery to steam engine installation.
So was there an immediate supply of these people just ready and waiting?
Quite the opposite. There was an acute shortage, which is what drives up wages and forces innovation and training. Local newspaper advertisements, wage books from pioneering factories like Strutt's and Gregg's Quarry Bank Mill, private correspondence. It all confirms the scarcity.
You have letters from the inventors themselves, right?
We do. Matthew Boulton, James Watt's famous partner, complained constantly about the lack of qualified engine erectors.
And what specifically were they looking for? What was the skill set?
They needed people who were good at complex filing, turning, and precise installation. An engine erector in Manchester reported back to Boulton and Watt that it was almost impossible to find good millwrights and fitters, and that the very few general good filers and turners that are here are all engaged for a term of years in the different cotton mills.
So there was fierce competition for this scarce talent.
Which drove up wages significantly, making the investment in high-quality apprenticeship highly profitable for both the master and the apprentice.
So the market actively responded to this acute demand for skills.
It did. The sources use this exceptional data set, stamped tax registers on apprenticeship contracts from 1710 to 1770, and these records provide empirical evidence that a growing number of children were being apprenticed, specifically to these high-quality mechanical workmen.
So you can literally see the supply of skills rising to meet the new technological demand.
Precisely. It proves that technological changes in 18th century England were actively increasing the demand for skilled labor, and the market mechanisms, the parents and the apprentices themselves, were responding by increasing skill formation.
Now let's fast forward about a century. Britain, the originator of the Industrial Revolution, starts to lose its technological edge in the Second Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century to Germany. Why? How did that happen?
This is a textbook case of institutional failure to adapt. Britain relied on a private market solution, the Mechanics' Institutes.
I've heard of these.
They were founded by coalitions of artisans and capitalists to teach the science underlying the trades. But they failed to broadly educate the working class. They had poor attendance, there were political economy issues, and there was a lack of any tangible incentive to go.
So the skills remained localized.
Highly localized and controlled on the shop floor, often non-standardized, the system prioritized what they called individual excellence, which, as contemporary critics noted, was more philanthropic than patriotic.
So Britain sought individual brilliance, while Germany sought systematic competence.
That's the key difference. Germany, and particularly Prussia, took the opposite state-centric approach. They established a universal, centralized education system. And crucially, compulsory schooling laws preceded child labor laws by 75 years.
75 years.
It shows a profound state-level commitment to human capital formation before industrial demands even peaked.
And how is the German apprenticeship system structured to ensure such high standards?
German states structured apprenticeships to require both practical skill and formal theoretical knowledge. Apprentices had mandatory attendance at continuation schools.
What were those?
They were often financed by cities and large companies like Krupp, and they offered mandatory classes in essential fields like math, engineering, and physics. To be certified as a skilled worker, your school grades had to be sufficient. The skill was standardized and transferable across the entire country.
And what was the concrete, undeniable incentive for a young German worker to take all this formal education seriously?
It was the reduction of military service.
Oh, okay.
A young man who completed his formal education and achieved sufficient grades could shorten his mandatory military service from 3 years down to just 1 year, often with a higher rank, like an officer.
That is a powerful incentive.
It's a powerful incentive that was completely lacking in Britain's system. And the result speaks for itself. German apprentices received up to 5 times more formal, theoretical education than their British counterparts. This ensured a highly standardized, theoretically grounded workforce, which was exactly what the science-heavy Second Industrial Revolution required.
Okay, so we've tracked the path of progress through institutions, culture, and human capital. But these massive economic and technological leaps, they invariably generated profound social and biological costs. We have to ask the hard questions about the true standard of living during this transformation.
We do. It's a critical part of the story.
The most immediate social cost that comes to mind is child labor. And the sources suggest that legislation didn't solve this problem as quickly as we might like to believe.
Absolutely. The conventional narrative is, brave legislators passed laws and child labor vanished. But in Britain, Germany, and Belgium, the adoption of child labor laws often moved in tandem with, or even lagged, the general decline in child labor.
So the laws were following the trend, not creating it.
It suggests that the primary drivers were economic. Things like rising family income, which allowed parents to finally pull their children out of work, and also new technology, which reduced the need for those small, fast hands.
How did technology reduce the demand for child labor?
Well, the earlier machinery, particularly in textile production, required small, agile hands to perform these delicate tasks, like piecing together broken threads under massive, dangerous machines. As technology advanced, safety features were added, and automated processes took over many of these tasks.
So economic forces were already pushing down the demand for child labor before the full legislative weight was even felt.
In many cases, yes. And where legislation was enacted, enforcement was a huge problem, especially in Britain.
How so?
Enforcement was notoriously weak because the necessary machinery for implementation just wasn't provided. Years after the Mining Act was passed in 1842, which prohibited women and young children from working underground, officials lamented that no machinery has been provided for carrying it into effect.
So it was just a law on paper.
Largely. Despite the law, it remained notorious that boys under 10 were still working in collieries, illustrating this massive gap between parliamentary intent and the on-the-ground reality.
And moving from the factory to the urban environment itself, we see a clear decline in the biological standard of living as massive populations just crammed into these new industrializing cities.
The experience in New York City in the mid-19th century is a really stark example of this.
What happened there?
Looking at antebellum New York, the biological standard of living deteriorated rapidly, and this was driven largely by nutrition and the disease environment. The sources show that per capita, fresh, red meat consumption declined by 20 to 25% from its historically high levels in the early republic.
And that was a supply problem.
It was a supply problem. Urban demand grew way faster than the capacity to supply fresh, high-quality food to the city.
So not only less meat, but what was available was likely poor quality.
Much worse quality. And this was due to institutional failure and deregulation. The rapid growth led to the decline of the traditional public market system. This meant a complete loss of institutional oversight on food quality.
So the inspectors who used to check for meat that was measly or affected by disease,
They lost their authority. The stench of unregulated slaughterhouses was pervasive in parts of the city.
and I'm guessing this wasn't an equal opportunity problem across the city.
No, it was highly spatial and class-based. The quality loss disproportionately affected the working class, immigrant Eastern wards. These areas were systematically underserved by high-quality public markets, forcing residents to rely on unregulated groceries and opportunistic street vendors selling lower-quality, often diseased, meat.
Meanwhile, the wealthiest districts were situated right near the largest, most expensive public markets, which gave them a kind of institutional protection.
Exactly. New Yorkers paid a price of their biological well-being for relinquishing their institutional capacity to inspect and regulate food quality. And while obtaining meat might have been more convenient in terms of distance for the poor, it was, as the source says, almost certainly not as wholesome.
That's a grim picture.
This combination of worsening diet and worsening disease environments in the dense urban setting contributed directly to the deteriorating biological standard of living, which you can measure through indicators like physical stature.
And finally, we have to look at the human cost of social inequality and discrimination, using Civil War veterans as a tragic measure of life outcomes after the war.
The source material provides a deeply insightful comparison using the Union Army dataset, and it focuses on Black and Irish veterans. The comparison is meticulous. It looks at slave-born Blacks versus free-born Blacks and foreign-born Irish versus native-born white, non-Irish veterans.
And what does it find?
The statistical evidence points strongly to inferior long-term outcomes for two specific marginalized groups, slave-born Blacks and foreign-born Irish.
How significant were these disparities in terms of life itself?
The differences were just tragic. The shortest-lived group, statistically, was the slave-born veterans of the USCT, the United States Colored Troops. They lived to an average age of 65.3 years. That's more than 4 years less than the native-born Irish veterans.
Which speaks to the enduring trauma of slavery and the health disparities imposed by racism and poverty.
It does. And beyond sheer survival, you have to look at the institutional discrimination after the war.
Where do we see that?
It's painfully evident in the health records, specifically in the Pension Bureau ratings. The Pension Bureau determined eligibility for disability payments, and Black veterans were systematically less likely to be rated for chronic conditions than white veterans.
Which suggests a clear institutional bias in diagnosis, rather than them actually being healthier.
That's the only logical conclusion. Can I give you a concrete example of how this bias shows up in the data?
Easy.
Look at cardiovascular disease. The incidence of cardiovascular causes of death was curiously lower for slave-born Blacks than any other group in the study.
Which is the exact opposite of what we know about contemporary health trends for the Black population.
The complete opposite. What this statistical anomaly tells us is that institutional bias was literally altering the health records of Black veterans.
Meaning that the bias in the initial diagnosis, which tied them to the pension system, obscured the real causes of their deaths and effectively denied them the pensions and medical care that their white counterparts relied on.
Precisely. The outcome data reveals the long-term structural costs of racial and immigrant prejudice. And while some individual free-born Blacks may have achieved a degree of professional success with a larger proportion in high white-collar occupations than the foreign-born Irish, the statistical evidence strongly suggests inferior, suppressed outcomes for the most marginalized groups within the veteran population. It highlights how progress and economic growth are so unequally distributed.
So, what does this all mean? We've covered centuries of history here, from 14th century famine avoidance all the way to 19th century urban health crises. We've seen that the road to industrialization was paved not only by scientific genius and economic efficiency, but also by a set of incredibly fragile and often paradoxical institutional factors.
It's an incredibly complex tapestry. We've seen that sustained progress is built on a fundamental cultural belief system, a rejection of fatalism, that needed institutions like the Republic of Letters to thrive and spread.
And we showed that market security isn't always achieved through the ideal limited government model we hear about.
Not at all. Sometimes it relies on these private exclusive networks like the Genoese bankers managing massive state risk through early securitization, or even on the unexpected dark logic of state centralization, like the French crown inadvertently stamping out witch trials while just trying to collect its taxes more efficiently.
And critically, every step of this growth came at a profound, measurable biological and social cost.
It did. Whether it was the malnourished English laborer living just above subsistence, the urban poor in New York eating unregulated, unwholesome meat, or the Civil War veterans facing institutional discrimination in their pension claims, the most vulnerable segments of society really bore the weight of this massive transformation.
The sources reveal this deep tension between individual initiative and systematic public support.
They do. And it brings us to a final thought. We saw how the British system of education, which was designed to foster individual brilliance through these fragmented private initiatives like the Mechanics Institutes, ultimately led to national technological decline when it was pitted against Germany's state-backed, systematically applied theoretical training. So this raises an important question for you, the listener, to mull over. In complex, competitive global systems, can individual brilliance and entrepreneurial zeal ever truly compensate for a lack of standardized, publicly guaranteed institutional support that ensures a high baseline of competence for the entire nation?